People don't get the big picture. Animals matter, people matter, and animals in the lives of people matter. Noel Fitzpatrick. Hi, Elise/Aquilacat here, and today I'm going to go over why we can't stop using animals in laboratory research. To answer the title question right off the bat, it's mostly because it's a complex ethical issue that has no immediate solution, because technology isn't currently advanced enough for us to completely achieve this goal right now, and because both governments and the science community can be stubbornly resistant to change. So let's get into why that is and what's being done about it. First off, because I know how passionate people are about this subject, including myself, let me just briefly touch on the ethics involved. Animals matter versus humans matter. I see talk of these two sides pitted against each other all the time, but not enough people pause to consider that both matter. Each side has their own justifications for what they think is right, and depending on your mindset, both sides have valid points. Over time, laws in society both have developed from only humans matter to somewhere in between now of both matter, but there's still more we need to do before we can fully stop use of lab animals. Now, I ain't here to argue on the ethics. Theoretical arguments are not my strength. As a whole, the scientific community appears to be in agreement that phasing out the use of lab animals is beneficial for everyone involved. The issue is just how to do it. So given this, I would rather take what we currently have going on and then apply relevant theory to improve upon it. Take action instead of wasting time and breath on why one mindset is better than the other. Humans matter. Animals matter. So how can we consolidate or combine those two stances into one with a common goal? Well, the way I see it is that we need to simultaneously improve animal welfare for lab animals, work on shifting from the use of lab animals to other alternatives, balance that out with ensuring research is still moving forward to improve our own health and lives, and at the same time, those of animals as well, because there's a lot of overlap in treatments and drugs being used for both human and veterinary medicine, and encouraging governments and regulatory agencies to get on the same page and enforce the regulations to encourage the community as a whole to actually utilize alternatives. Now, the nice thing is society in general is already on this path. There are ways to do this, but the crux of the matter is that we haven't yet reached the point where we can accomplish this goal. And unlike a dietary choice, like going vegetarian or vegan, we can't just do a stop cold turkey approach when it comes to laboratory research. When it affects everyone and not just one person, it's up to society as a whole to make that decision and see it to completion. And we all need to work together to do that. So a bit of history on me and what got me in on this was back when I was a tween, like in the early 2000s, I was incredibly passionate about animal welfare and angry at the reality of the situation. I went vegetarian for 5 years. It didn't work out well because I hated soy and I hated tofu. I hated all of the healthy alternatives, so I mostly just lived on junk food. But I went vegetarian for 5 years, and I also volunteered with PETA, which, if you don't know, is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Except, it turns out they ain't actually all that ethical. Now, they did do some good and brought awareness to some issues, but then they also champion extremely ridiculous matters that don't help anyone. And then when it was discovered that they euthanize more animals than they actually save, well, that was the final nail in the coffin for me. So once I realized that, I switched to supporting organizations like the Humane Society instead. And speaking of the Humane Society, they put out a PSA a few years ago about cosmetic testing on rabbits that I personally think was far more well done than any of PETA's attempted PSAs, mostly because it focuses on empathizing with and then rallying passion to take action instead of PETA's tendency to shock and shame. But I remember seeing the PETA videos and stories, including the stories about laboratory animals, like the Silver Spring monkeys. Now, if you don't know, that was a case in the 1980s where macaque monkeys were taken from the wild, surgically altered to not be able to feel pain in certain limbs, mistreated, and then kept in poor conditions. It truly was awful, and thanks to PETA, it did end up in the Supreme Court, and it even got the National Institutes of Health, who funded the research in the first place, to do their own investigation on it. They found conditions were so bad that they cut off the lab's access to the funding, at least for a little bit. Funding was later reestablished after the court case and appeals that followed. But it was still acknowledged that the standards for the animal care was severely lacking. It did result in some important information for the science community, but at a large cost. The irony of that case is that once the lab was shut down and the animals taken away, PETA was against euthanizing the monkeys, even though it was the morally ethical choice at that point. And yet a few decades later, they euthanized more animals than they actually saved, so talk about hypocritical. And one of my friends has personal experience with how unethical PETA can be. They worked at a lab where, when possible, dogs were given over to rescues for adoption after the research was done. They sourced their dogs from a local animal shelter, who gave them animals that were going to be euthanized for being there too long anyway, so the dogs at least got a second chance at life from being brought to the lab. And then PETA got involved and threatened the shelter workers, making the shelter stop providing animals for the research. So the lab instead had to go to breeders for their dogs, and all of those dogs eventually had to be euthanized at the end of the research, because none of them passed the rescue's evaluation to be adoptable because the breeders had kept them all in small cages and never bothered to train them. Now, the lab had large areas for the dogs to stay in, but these large areas scared the dogs that came from the breeders because it was way more space than they were used to, and they didn't know how to handle it. And despite the laboratory staff working with the dogs to try training them to be adoptable eventually, they still weren't adoptable. They didn't know how to be dogs, is how my friend described it. This not only shows how detrimental PETA can be, but also how some animals used in research can give them a second lease on life, how there can be issues on the back end with where laboratories can source their animals, and also just another reason why I dislike many pet breeders. If you're interested in any of those topics, let me know, and I'll talk about them in another video, because there is a lot I could talk about there. But going back to this, back then in the early 2000s, I couldn't fathom why animals were being used in laboratory experiments at all, and was very much so against it in its entirety. Though, to be fair, it was never the benefits of experimentation that was ever mentioned, only ever the bad things about it. There wasn't quite as much information on the internet back then as there is today to fact-check things. And on top of that, I was dealing with the childhood black and white way of thinking, not realizing there was so much nuance involved in the matter. Now that I'm older and realize many matters have a gray area to them and aren't all just black and white, right and wrong, I can see why animals are still used in some laboratory research that results in their pain and suffering, like in pharmaceutical and toxicological studies. New drugs, for example, until very recently in the United States, still required the use of animal studies first before they could be tested on humans and then used in a clinical setting. Thankfully, as of 2023, that is no longer a requirement, but the law change only removed animal testing as a requirement. It didn't ban it. Alternative methods exist for many aspects of research that lab animals are used for, but not everyone is willing to utilize them, and governments aren't always willing to force their hand with stricter laws or to incentivize using alternative methods. Now, over the years, alternatives have been and are still being found to allow researchers to gather all the data they need to meet the regulatory requirements, while either entirely replacing the use of animals in some areas of research, or at least finding ways to reduce the number of animals used to minimize the amount of them that need to be euthanized until further alternative methods can be found. And considering the ethics of animal use in scientific research is relatively new, since there really wasn't much legislation on it until the 1980s. Now, historically, very little time has been devoted to this particular issue, although the ethics of animal welfare in general has been debated for ages. So back in the 400 to 500s BC, Pythagoras argued that for as long as people killed animals, they would be willing to kill each other. A while later, in the early to mid-300s BC, Aristotle argued that killing animals was only justified when it was for the purpose of helping people achieve their goals, claiming that animals did not behave morally or rationally, but were capable of feeling. And this line of thinking supported vivisections, which is when experimental operations were performed on animals for educational or research purposes, and has been a practice going back since as far as 500 BC. And then in the 1600s, René Descartes claimed that animals didn't feel pain at all, and so could not feel suffering. The prevailing thought was that using animals in research was just a means to an end. As long as scientific advancements were made, it didn't matter what the animals were subjected to. And animals are used as test subjects because they are biologically similar to us and deal with some of the same health issues that we do. And because many of them have fairly short life cycles, it allows for researchers to easily observe an entire lifespan. In more recent centuries, the term in vivo was coined, and this just refers to studies that are performed on living organisms. One of the first in vivo studies in drug research was utilized when Alexander Fleming, along with Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, tested penicillin on mice to show how effective the antibiotic could be. In vivo research has also been used during development of various vaccines, such as the ones for polio, tuberculosis, meningitis, and HPV. Survival rates for cancer in general have improved over time because of in vivo research, mostly using mice. Some examples of this are the HPV previously mentioned, but also Herceptin and tamoxifen for breast cancer. In vivo research was also used to develop HAART treatment for AIDS patients. Testing on animals has also led to improved health care for animals, given that the vaccines we give our pets to protect them against rabies, distemper, and kennel cough all were developed with in vivo research on animals. So we owe a whole lot to the medical advancements that have happened through the use of in vivo research, and yet we also owe a whole lot to the animals being used. And for as long as we need to use them, we owe it to them to give them the best quality of life possible while in our care. And to really drive home the point as to how little attention was given to the welfare of animals, the first United States textbook of veterinary anesthesia didn't even list pain as a reason for using anesthesia. It just wasn't considered that animals could feel pain like we do. And in 1989, the head of the National Institutes of Health dangerously claimed that science should never be hindered by ethical considerations, and was referring specifically to how controversial scientific advances could be. Regulations surrounding managing the pain that laboratory animals experience weren't even put into place until a 1992 report from the National Research Council and the 1996 PHS Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, which suggested that any experiment that caused pain or distress in humans should also be considered to cause pain and distress to animals. So it's only been in recent decades that managing pain and suffering in laboratory animals has been focused on, with regulations put into place to help them, much less that there has been a focus on banning the use of laboratory animals. Now, it is commonly accepted that many animals can feel pain and suffering. And even without scientific research to delve into the details to confirm that, anyone who has ever had a pet dog, cat, mouse, or rat could tell you with certainty that these animals have emotions and can also feel fear and pain. So as much as this issue should have been addressed long before it was, we have to accept the fact that it wasn't and just keep looking forward. Public outcry seems to be the biggest reason historically that directed focus to laboratory animal welfare. As I mentioned in the intro, PETA, as awful as they are, did bring the focus of it very publicly with the Silver Spring monkey case. But even before that, it was brought to the public's attention in the 1960s when pet dogs and cats were being stolen to use in laboratory research, shining light not just on the research itself, but also where laboratories got the animals from. Like Walt Disney's 101 Dalmatians in 1961 highlighted pet theft because it was a thing that was happening at the time. But the biggest case involving this was in 1965 when a dog, a Dalmatian named Pepper, was stolen from a backyard and then sold to a hospital where she was used in research and died. After an extensive search, her owners, Julia and Peter Lakovich, found out what happened to Pepper. Someone had seen a man load a Dalmatian into his truck near their farm. The Green Dragon Market was a known place that was already being investigated for auctioning off stolen animals. Julia Lakovich found out about it through her searches for Pepper and investigated it herself 3 days after her dog disappeared. She found out that Pepper had ended up at a weekly swap that took place on the property of a dog catcher who was suspected of snatching up both strays and pets and selling them to research labs. Both people at the Green Dragon Market and people involved in these animal swaps had been targets of authorities and the Humane Society alike. Fines were issued, charges filed, but business as usual still occurred. In fact, it was a story in their local paper about 20 animals being transported to one of these swaps, whose driver had been fined and eventually got the animals back the next day, that clued in Peter Lakovich, who was stuck recovering in a hospital bed during the search, to a hint about Pepper, since the story had mentioned that 2 female Dalmatians were among the animals. But when Julia traveled to investigate further, she was turned away and unable to inspect the dogs on the farm that the news story led her to, and authorities were not able or willing to assist, and she was forced to go back home. A government information specialist, Faye Brisk, found out about the LaCavige's search for Pepper and got politicians involved. Another news story came out about the search for Pepper and possible research laboratory connections. Further efforts from Faye Brisk resulted in authorities finding a guy who sold Dalmatians to a hospital, where it was then confirmed that Pepper had indeed been there, but no longer was. The search had still been ongoing when Pepper died. Medical researchers at the hospital had tried implanting her with an experimental cardiac pacemaker. The procedure went awry, and she passed away and was cremated. And then the public found out more about it when Pepper's story was published in several magazines. This is the defining incident that finally gave animal welfare advocates the leverage they needed to break a stalemate in Congress at the time, leading to the United States Congress passing the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act in 1966. Though that had its limitations from the start, like only focusing on protecting warm-blooded animals and not including rodents at all. Worldwide, around the 70s and 80s, the EU and countries like Sweden, Australia, and Canada put regulations into place with a focus on the ethics of laboratory animal welfare. The USA's 1966 Laboratory Animal Welfare Act was updated in the 80s, followed by regulations being put in place in India in the 90s and then the United Kingdom in the year 2000, and then the European Union updated their policies in 2010. Ethics committees are usually responsible for ensuring any experiments being planned are ethical before they can be approved to take place. And around this time, the science community also started taking an interest in actually researching the details of how animals feel pain and distress. Published research papers throughout the 90s and early 2000s detailed how distressed animals respond with fear and aggression in various ways, such as non-human primates scratching and anxiety, or how many animals have specific vocalizations when they're distressed, or using biomarkers like how their bodies react to distress with increased release of corticosteroid hormones and increased heart rate. Though research on how they feel when content or happy isn't as prevalent, since it can be hard to tell if an interaction between a lab animal and caretaker or researcher is positive or if it's just neutral, other than the obvious tells of like animals choosing to go to or be near certain people more than others, or animals being willing to be trained to do certain tasks for positive rewards, like petting and, especially when it comes to rats, tickling. Positive interactions like these were often discouraged in the past for fear of preferential treatment or picking favorites, could potentially interfere with the data obtained, or could cause burnout and turmoil among the researchers and caretakers when that animal ended up needing to be euthanized. However, now it's common for bonds to form, and caretakers and researchers are generally encouraged to improve animal welfare and quality of life as much as possible. As far as public attitude towards this goes, it tends to be the more cute or the more relatable species that garner the most outcry, such as dogs, non-human primates, cats, and rabbits, whereas animals like mice and rats don't cause as much public concern and so end up with less protections. The public also tends to support the use of animals like fish and invertebrates, since people don't empathize with those animals as much either. Your mileage may vary, of course, but it seems that has been the general mindset of society in the last few decades. As far as regulations and laws go, the focus mostly is centered over the amount of pain and suffering an animal can feel. For example, the USDA's regulations in 1998 stated that any procedure causing more than momentary or slight pain and distress should be performed under sedation or anesthesia and should only last as long as absolutely necessary. And the Public Health Service policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals requires that animals suffering from unrelieved severe or chronic distress should be euthanized either at the end of the procedure or, if appropriate, during the procedure. Now, the ethics surrounding this is that even though euthanizing animals at the end of an experiment might be morally iffy, leaving the animal alive after the experiment to further suffer would be even more morally wrong, and so euthanasia would be ethically correct, like in the case of the silver spring monkeys with PETA. Again, your mileage may vary on that with the thought process, but it is what led to those regulations. In the United States, there is no way to accurately determine how many animals experience unrelieved pain and distress, because there are no reporting requirements for rats and mice like is required for other animals. We don't even know how many animals are used in research globally, since not all countries even track that information. Although through the data that can be obtained about this, from both the United States and Canada at least, regulatory testing accounts for most of the animals that experience unrelieved pain and distress. Slowly, the world is realizing that the benefits of scientific advancement might not always be worth the suffering of animals. A good example of this is that rabbits used to be a very common laboratory animal used in the testing of new cosmetic products, as I brought up with the Save Ralph video before. Public outcry against it led to finding replacements for the use of rabbits in those kinds of testing. Bernard E. Rollin, who assisted in drafting up the first laboratory animal welfare laws in the United States back in the 1970s, stated that it had become clear that what bothered the public the most at that time wasn't that animals were being euthanized in experiments, but that they were suffering and in distress. And in addition to the considerations of the public, another reason the laws were drafted was because animals weren't receiving the best possible treatment. There was actually pushback to the United States aiming to regulate animal research in 1985, with those in opposition to the regulations claiming it would endanger human health. However, regulating the welfare of laboratory animals and ensuring they were well cared for didn't endanger human health at all, and might have even led to better research. There have been great strides made over the last few decades to centralize the focus on animal welfare in a laboratory setting. However, there is still a long ways to go. Thanks to public outcry in the last few decades, countries around the world have created laws to improve animal welfare in research settings, and in so doing, scientists have been encouraged to find alternatives when possible to reduce the amount and kinds of animals used in laboratory research. And finding alternatives like this falls under the replacement aspect of a popular ethical guide in the field of animal ethics, first described in 1959 and widely utilized now, which is Russell and Birch's 3 R's, namely replacement, reduction, and refinement. Replacement refers to finding replacements for animals in research, whether that's through computer models or substituting invertebrates and fish in place of rodents and mammals. Reduction aims to reduce the amount of animals used, or at least reduce the amount of animals that are put into distressful or painful situations if replacement is not feasible. An example of this is like finding out that data obtained through the use of 10 rats is sufficient, instead of using 50 rats. And refinement refers to the vague and broad concept of refining experiments to keep replacement and reduction in mind, improving the quality of life for the animals used in the experiment, and otherwise aim for the least amount of pain and suffering as possible. And this ethical guide has been widely adopted by the scientific community worldwide. Sometimes regulations being put into place has spurred on creativity and resourcefulness in the scientific community when they have been forced to find ways to comply with the regulations. One example of this is when the 2003 amendment to the European Union's Cosmetics Directive declared an end to animal testing for cosmetics products completely by 2009, regardless of if any replacements had been found by that time. That ultimatum spurred on motivation in the science community, not just in the EU, but also worldwide, to find alternative methods to using animals whenever possible. Now, there are many different kinds of research that uses animals, and in some areas of study, many alternatives have already been found to eliminate the use of animals, such as in cosmetics testing. However, even though suitable alternatives exist, and some places have laws cracking down on this, there are still many places that test on animals like rabbits anyway for cosmetics testing when they no longer need to. So, non-compliance and not adapting to change can be an issue with this. And that's especially prevalent right now in the United States, with the FDA deciding as of last year that animal testing is no longer required for use in drug tests. But they didn't ban it, they just lifted the requirement. So it's still up to laboratories and researchers themselves to choose to use alternatives. Like, they aren't really incentivized to do it other than just because it's the morally right thing to do. And when testing the safety and effectiveness of a new drug, scientists need to know what dosages are safe and which dosages are too much and will cause harm. And it's in this preclinical phase of drug discovery that animals are still used before a drug can move on to human test subjects, because alternative uses for animals either haven't been found yet, or alternatives that are available aren't accurate or reliable enough to fully replace them. The key word here being yet. And then some of the issues that result with this are some alternatives work well in vitro, so in cultured cells or in cultured tissues, like in a petri dish, but fail in vivo, which means in live animals, like with animal testing. And then, like, the bodies of insects and other invertebrates are very different from ours, and they might react differently to treatments than our own bodies would, so they are only helpful to reduce the amount of vertebrates used later in testing instead of completely replacing their use. And obtaining funding to find alternatives to animal use can also be a barrier to replacing animals in the lab. So in the future, we very likely will get to the point where we can completely replace the use of animals in lab research, but more work needs to be done to find more alternatives and also to refine and standardize the alternatives we already have, and also to just encourage all laboratories and all researchers to actually utilize the alternatives that we do have. So before we delve into the current alternatives available, you might be wondering, well, why don't we just replace lab animals with human subjects? Well, that's because there's a lot of issues with that. For experiments that result in pain or death, there would be no way to get enough volunteers for the experiments. No scientific advancements would get done, or it would take an extremely long time to advance because of the lack of volunteers. Well, you might say, if people don't volunteer, then why not just make them? The incarcerated are already used to clean our highways, so why not make them be laboratory research subjects too? Now, I honestly don't even want to entertain this question, but I've seen it online enough that apparently it needs to be addressed. So, for one, we are animals too. If we're stopping all lab animal use, then humans would be included in that. And then where would you draw that line? Offer a criminal to give themselves over to experimentation in lieu of the death penalty? Like how the Game of Thrones gives criminals the option of joining the Night's Watch on the Wall instead of being executed? Like, on one hand, yes, they're being given an option, but on the other hand, it's a decision made under duress, which presents both ethical and legal issues. And what if that person is innocent after all? Not all who are incarcerated are actually guilty of the crimes. Like, we would come across the same kind of ethical issues that we come across in debates about the death penalty and with incarceration being used as modern-day slavery. It's inhumane, and it's awful, and it's just not a feasible alternative. The goal is to improve our lives, not to make it worse. So to sum it up, experimenting on humans is no better than experimenting on animals. So that option is out. So what now? Well, there are a few options. One is replacing the use of mammals, like dogs, cats, non-human primates, and rodents, with fish and invertebrates instead. It isn't a perfect solution and has its own ethical issues still because they are still animals, but it is an option being utilized. The other is finding ways to utilize cells or computers to replace all animal use. It's a great option because it hurts nobody, but it also isn't perfect because it doesn't cover all areas of research. And as for more specific alternatives, like I referred to in the intro with the Humane Society's Save Ralph video, rabbits have commonly been used in cosmetics testing. One of the tests referenced in that video is the Drey's eye irritancy test. Multiple methods were devised in the late 90s and early 2000s that reduced the amount of rabbits needed. Basically, if one of the methods tested positive, then no animals were needed at all because it was too corrosive or irritating to be tested on them. If the substance tested negative, then animals were used to confirm that the substance was safe, and it was expected that few animals would develop corrosive lesions. The policies were also modified to immediately end the experiment and euthanize the animal as soon as lesions appeared to reduce the amount of time the animal suffered. In recent years, partly thanks to the EU policy I mentioned before, setting an ultimatum of banning all cosmetic testing by 2009, they further improved on this by finding an alternative through the use of eggs. The CAM assay, standing for chorioallantoic membrane assay, was offered as an alternative to the Drey's eye irritancy test. This membrane is present in chicken eggs, and scientists are able to observe this membrane's reactions to potentially corrosive substances instead of observing those reactions on rabbits. 3D skin models have also replaced the use of animals in cosmetics toxicity testing and with testing pesticides. In the European Union, animals have been banned from use in cosmetic testing since 2013, but it doesn't protect them from other areas of testing. And even though a total of 45 countries have all banned the use of animals in cosmetics testing, many other places around the world haven't banned it yet. So progress on this and other areas of animal testing varies depending on where in the world you are. The biggest focus on improving welfare in testing, like LD50 and vaccine testing, is to change the goalposts for the endpoints. An endpoint is the point at which pain and suffering has reached the point where the experiment ends and an animal is humanely euthanized. Sometimes the endpoint isn't reached until the animal is on the brink of death, or the endpoint is just once the animal dies, which historically was the case with vaccine potency testing. Humane endpoints aim to reach this point of requiring euthanasia before the pain and suffering even starts, while still trying to ensure the needed data is obtained for the experiment while doing so. And using biomarkers like body temperature changes or increased levels of certain proteins during some infections are examples of some ways that they have measured for a humane endpoint in rodents. There's also a focus on ensuring that the methods of euthanasia are humane and as painless and less stress-inducing as possible. Modifying procedures can help here, and there are a few methods that help to reduce their suffering and/or use fewer animals than other methods. In vitro cytotoxicity methods are alternatives that can help reduce how severe the pain is and how long the animal is suffering during these experiments. These cytotoxicity assays can help estimate a starting dose for LD50 testing and might be able to reduce animal use by 28% for oral testing, so like when ingesting substances. In vitro means in glass and refers to the use of test tubes, cell cultures, or other experiments performed outside of a living organism. Examples are tissue and organ cultures, including organs on chips and 3D tissue models started from human cells and tissue. These alternatives aim to address the issue of the effects of toxicity in animals, not necessarily reflecting how a human body would respond. Now, acute lethality testing, aka LD50 that I mentioned before, during the process of drug discovery is one of the big areas of research where animal testing still takes place. Drug discovery is the process of finding new medications and going through the testing process to show that they're efficient and safe to use. Acute lethality testing, developed in the 1920s, is when a substance is administered through ingestion, inhalation, or topically on the skin, and seeing what dose or amount of the substance results in the death of half of a test group, with the animals being observed for signs of toxicity and for death over the course of a couple weeks. This test has been refined to require less animals than before and to euthanize animals before they reach the point of pain and suffering. LD50 testing has its limitations. One of the problems is that lethal dose of a substance in animals might not reflect accurately to a lethal dose in humans, or the medication may have a toxic effect on humans that it didn't have on animals during that period of testing. A devastating example of this limitation is thalidomide, which had horrible effects in humans that it didn't have during testing on rodents. Alternatives like testing on human cells can better predict how a medication will affect a human and be more specified to focus on the effects on particular organs. There are also alternative assays that use rat cells instead of testing on rats themselves. Organs on chips that grow from human cells is also a good alternative and has been shown to be very promising. However, it hasn't received regulatory approval yet as an alternative. In silico testing through the use of computers can help predict how toxic a substance will be before it's ever used on an animal, thereby helping to reduce the number of animals that otherwise would be hurt or die from it. These methods may one day replace the use of LD50 testing, but we aren't at that point yet. They do have limitations, since testing on cells doesn't allow researchers to observe how a substance will affect an entire body, and in silico testing requires us to already know detailed information on the toxicity of a substance before it can predict how toxic it would be to a living organism, and we don't always have that data available. Some alternatives have been approved by regulatory agencies, and they should absolutely be utilized until more alternatives are approved for use. Vaccine potency testing is another big one that results in the death of animals to make sure vaccines are both safe to use and also effective. So in animal testing, animals are inoculated with the experimental vaccine and then exposed to the pathogen to see how efficiently the vaccine protects them. Many aren't protected enough by the dose and get sick or die. There are some in vitro alternatives available that test for antibodies in the blood of the animals after vaccination, which eliminates the need to expose animals to whatever they were being vaccinated against. This method has been approved for tetanus vaccines and a couple others, but not for all types of vaccines. Now, if vaccine safety is proven to meet regulatory requirements without the use of animal testing, then it's possible to avoid animal testing altogether, but it's up to the lab and researchers to provide that proof to the regulatory agency. And then another alternative is replacing vertebrate test subjects with invertebrates, especially zebrafish, fruit flies, brine shrimp, and roundworms. And to further work toward the goal of not using animals, including fish, the FET test, standing for Fish Embryo Toxicity Test, is a possible alternative to using juvenile or adult fish. And then the use of toxicogenetics seems promising to pinpoint possible toxins via biomarkers, like I mentioned before testing on animals even starts, to help reduce the number of animals used. Another way to predict toxicity effects is through PBPK modeling. This stands for physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling and is a mathematical technique that can reduce the amount of animals needed in toxicity testing. And then cell biological assays have allowed the number of lab animals used to be halved since the 1970s. It does have some limitations of false positive results on occasion, but is otherwise a good alternative. Microdosing in human volunteers, so testing drugs in minimal amounts in human volunteers and observing what happens, can certainly help reduce the number of animals used, but can't replace animal use completely because the effects on the body of a microdose won't accurately show what the effects would be at a therapeutic dose. In silico computer analyses can provide data resulting in less animals being used. In silico means in silicon and refers to using computers for research. Some in silico examples are ToxCast, a program from the Environmental Protection Agency in 2007 that screens and prioritizes chemicals for potential toxicity in humans, and is a resource used by researchers focusing on toxicity and chemical biology. Another example is the Korean National Institute of Food and Drug Safety Evaluation Center that develops systems for in silico evaluation of toxicity that they set up in 2010. It aims to use eco-friendly technology and molecular biology to evaluate and predict toxic responses in cells or tissues. In Korea, more than 150 million mice are used for toxicity testing each year, and this center expects their methods to be able to reduce the use of lab animals, specifically mice, to less than half of that number. Now, thanks to all of the alternatives developed so far, the use of primates, rabbits, guinea pigs, and other mammals have been reduced, but mice, rats, and even dogs are still a very common test subject. And despite all the advancements made, there are still some areas of research that no reliable alternative to replace the use of animals has been found yet, such as when evaluating cytotoxicity in bone marrow or in asthma research. Specifically with drug discovery, in silico models appear very promising, and the alternatives available can reduce costs and make the drug development process go a bit quicker. The difficult part is that because there is no one perfect alternative, you have to find a good balance of alternatives to suit the experiment while also trying to maintain accuracy of the data. And then the method that might be able to save more animals than any other method on its own is international harmonization of guidelines. By basically getting everyone on the same page globally with testing guidelines, duplicate testing can be minimized. And the less duplicated tests that are run, the less animals need to be used. Now, society can and should keep improving animal welfare and laboratory research until the time comes when their use is no longer necessary, especially in pharmaceutical and toxicological research. Laws are either already in place or in the process of being improved in many countries, but there also needs to be a focus on finding more alternatives to animal use. Many alternatives are already in place and are being considered and developed, but scientists should continue to discover new alternatives that will eventually allow the use of animals to no longer be needed in toxicological testing. Wherever animals can be replaced, they are being replaced, and when it's necessary to use them, then they're used as minimally as possible. Now, future technological improvements might help us get to that goal of animals no longer being used in laboratory research at all, but more funding will be needed so scientists can focus on developing further alternatives and refining and standardizing current alternatives. For now, what the community can do is treat the animals in their care with the utmost respect, ensure their enclosures are spacious and that they are provided with enrichment, attention, and love, and do everything possible to ensure their pain and suffering, when necessary, is minimized as much as possible. We can also urge companies to eliminate animal testing in their labs, and governments should keep being urged to make legal changes to make it a requirement to utilize alternatives. It seems we're in a transitional state right now when it comes to animal testing. Many laboratories and countries are on board to eliminate animal testing, but other governments and laboratories aren't. It will continue to be a problem until everyone globally can get on the same page about this. So with all this in mind, you might be feeling a little bit helpless. If you aren't involved in the legal, political, or science communities, you might feel like there isn't much you can do to make a change. However, there's plenty that you can do, that I can do, that all of us individually can do to to help reach that eventual goal of no lab animal needing to suffer or be in pain, and to work toward completely replacing animals in lab research altogether. You can reach out to your local politicians and let your voice be heard, or sign petitions. Let your government know that the people want to eliminate animal testing. Public outcry, as we've seen in the past, can lead to change. Some information for how to do this can be found at the bottom of the website here on the screen. You can volunteer for animal welfare organizations like the Humane Society or the ASPCA, or donate money to them if you have extra to spare, since they are constantly fighting to eliminate the need for animal testing. Choose products wisely. The Humane Society for the United States recommends the website currently on screen now to help you locate companies that sell cruelty-free products. And the AAALAC has a directory of accredited organizations around the world that you can support at the website here. The more that companies see they'll lose money by not getting with the times and eliminating animal testing, the more likely they will be to implement that change in the laboratories they use. And then you can also become inspired and take action, whether that's through spreading awareness with a focus on actions to take, because otherwise it's all passion with no plan, or contribute to solving the problem through your career or hobby. For you, that might be working in computer programming or something to help find and improve methods to replace the use of animals, or becoming a chemist to find more information about the toxicity of substances before it gets to the animal testing stage to improve the in silico alternative methods, or using your influence in the legal or political fields to bring about legislative change so the laws continue to focus on improving animal welfare, or giving ultimatums to encourage more alternatives to be found. For me, given my vet tech background, perhaps that might look like working in a lab and helping to ensure the best quality of life possible for animals under my care until my job is no longer needed, or working with one of the accreditation or regulatory agencies that inspect labs and enforce the policies already in place to ensure their welfare and encourage laboratories to use alternatives. There really are endless possibilities with this. Passion for animal welfare is so important, but change doesn't happen by just wishing for circumstances to be different. If we want circumstances to be different than they currently are, then we have to find ways to make it so, and we have to find common ground and work together to be the change we wish to see in the world. Now, I hope you were able to see throughout this video just how complex this matter is and how many factors are actually involved. Now, if you, like me, are passionate about animal welfare and want to see a future where animals are no longer used in laboratory testing, then perhaps this video has helped to give you the knowledge that you need to inspire you to find a way to take action to bring the world closer to this goal. Now, if there's anything about this topic in particular you want to hear more about, let me know, and I'll see if I can make a video about it. In the meantime, keep an eye out for the next video, where I'll be talking about lilies and why they are so dangerous to your pets, especially to cats. But for now, farewell.